There are Sith who hunger for power, Sith who crave domination, and Sith who seek immortality. But Darth Tenebrous, the master of Darth Plagueis, was something entirely different. To Tenebrous, the Force was not a mystery. It was not a storm to be ridden or a current to be endured. It was not the mystical will that the Jedi whispered about, or the ravenous hunger that the Sith glorified. To Tenebrous, the Force was an equation, a vast field of probabilities, a current that could be calculated, predicted, and he believed, even rewritten. Tenebrous was born a Bith, a species whose minds were sharper than nearly any in the galaxy. His gift for numbers, for formula, and for logic became the lens through which he would eventually view the Force itself. Where other Sith bowed to its passions or the darkness, Tenebrous treated it like a machine that could be engineered. His greatest experiment would embody that belief, the creation of something known as the Maxichlorians, a retrovirus he designed to rewrite the very cells of his body, turning the living conduits of the Force into long-lived entities that would preserve his consciousness even after death. To Tenebrous, this was proof that he had solved what millennia of Sith mystics and alchemists had failed to achieve. He would not fade into the Force, he would not surrender his essence, he would persist forever, calculated, engineered, and eventually perfected. And this was only half of his ambition. For if midichlorians were to be altered to preserve life, they could also be corrupted to destroy it. Tenebrous dreamt of a virus that could sever the Jedi from the Force entirely, an extermination not of flesh and blood, but of connection itself. The Bith were famed for their musicians and their scientists, but Tenebrous took the clarity of perception and turned it upon the Force itself. He believed that every vision of the future, every surge of power, every whisper of destiny was not divine mystery, but rather mathematical inevitabilities. His fixation was on precognition, and while the Jedi relied on intuition and the Sith relied on passion, Tenebrous relied on calculations. He believed that the future could be modeled like a starship schematic, a series of moving pieces whose outcome could be predicted if one possessed enough computation. To him, foresight was not an art or a mysticism, it was engineering. This led to the most heretical belief, that the dark side of the Force was not a living will, not a malevolent current, but simply a source of energy, as controllable as plasma, as programmable as code. This view would shape everything he did. As Rugus Gnome, he designed some of the most advanced starships of the entire era, embedding his scientific brilliance into galactic engineering. As Tenebrous, he applied the same logic to the Sith's grand plan. It is easy to see how his arrogance grew. With each success, with each prediction that came true, he became more convinced that he had solved the riddle of the Force. To Tenebrous, the Jedi were deluded mystics, clinging to a philosophy of balance that had no grounding in reality. They treated the Force as sacred. Tenebrous treated it as circuitry. Yet, here lies the great irony. For in reducing the Force to a machine, Tenebrous blinded himself to its living essence. He believed he could not only predict the dark side's victory, but engineer it, that he could reshape the building blocks of the Force to serve his will. This conviction would lead him to his most infamous creation, the Maxichlorians. The midichlorians have been the foundation of a life's connection to the Force. Midichlorians are microscopic organisms that live in every cell, allowing communication with the currents of the galaxy itself. To the Jedi, they were a reminder that life and the Force were inseparable. To the Sith, they were proof that the Force could be measured, quantified, and even controlled. But to Tenebrous, midichlorians were not simply a connection to the Force. They were programmable, biological processors that could be rewritten and redesigned to serve a higher function. His most radical act was the creation of the Maxichlorians. Through a carefully engineered retrovirus, Tenebrous infected his own cells, altering his midichlorians to extend their lifespan beyond death. Where natural midichlorians would eventually dissolve back into the Force, Maxichlorians would linger, carrying fragments of his own consciousness forward. This was his answer to the greatest riddle of the Sith, the problem of mortality. For centuries, the Sith had sought to bind their souls, transfer their essence, or extend their lives through ritual and sorcery. Tenebrous dismissed these practices as primitive. He did not want to bargain with death through incantations or with alchemy. Tenebrous wanted a way to engineer death out of existence. And in his mind, he succeeded. When he died, his consciousness would not fade. It would persist through the Maxichlorians. He lived on, riding in the cells of the living, eternal not through ritual, but through science. But his triumph came at a cost. In rewriting his own biology, Tenebrous destroyed one of his greatest strengths, precognition, the gift of foresight that had once defined his genius. That was now completely gone. The equations no longer worked. His visions of the future became blind spots, blank horizons. But Tenebrous didn't mourn his loss. He considered it irrelevant. He had already calculated his future, the inevitability of the Sith's grand plan, the certainty of the dark side's ascendancy. He believed that foresight was now unnecessary, for he had already solved the equation of destiny. Here lies the core of his arrogance. To Darth Tenebrous, the Force was not alive. It did not have a will. It was not waiting to surprise him or to punish him. It was simply a current of energy, and he had rewritten its operating systems. This belief reveals why Tenebrous is so different from the other Sith, where Darth Bane bowed to the rule of two, where Darth Plagueis sought mastery through biology, and where Sidious sought dominance through politics. Tenebrous wanted to reprogram the very foundations of life. He was not content to master the Force as it was. He wanted to rewrite what the Force was allowed to be. The Maxichlorians were his first proof of this concept, his greatest achievement, his promise that when his body failed, his mind would not. He would endure in ways that no Sith ever had. But the Force is not an equation. It is not circuitry to be rewritten, and though Tenebrous did not yet realize it, the very creation he believed would make him immortal would become his eternal prison. For Tenebrous, immortality was only half of the equation. The other half was annihilation. If midichlorians could be rewritten to persist beyond death, then they could also be rewritten to die, to be silenced, to be erased. And if midichlorians were the conduit between life and the Force, then to silence them would be to silence the Force itself. This was Tenebrous's second great obsession, the creation of a targeted virus designed to sever the Jedi from all of their power. Not to kill them outright, not to cut them down with a lightsaber, but to strip them of the very gift that defined their existence. To Tenebrous, this was the ultimate proof of the dark side's supremacy, to turn the Jedi into ordinary beings with nothing but memory of what they had lost. The Jedi could not prepare for such a weapon. They had fought Sith Lords, faced armies, endured wars and purges, but no lightsaber could parry a virus. No meditation could preserve a connection once it was corrupted at a cellular level. To Tenebrous, this would be the ultimate victory, a clean solution. No battle, no victory on a field of war, but victory in biology. A single equation that would rewrite the destiny of the galaxy. He worked for decades on this project, refining his virus in secret laboratories, testing its theoretical potential. The virus was meant to infiltrate a Jedi's very cells, to alter their midichlorians so that they no longer responded to the currents of the Force. At its most ambitious stage, the project promised to burn out an entire bloodline of Jedi in a single generation, reducing them to husks with no access to the power that had defined them. But for all of his genius, this project ultimately failed. Tenebrous could not stabilize the virus, could not translate theory into weapon. It became a dead end, discarded but not forgotten. And yet, the horrors of this idea endured, because in the ambition of this experiment, we see the depths of Tenebrous's arrogance. He was not content to defeat the Jedi with war or politics or even deception. He wanted to delete them from the Force. It is here that we see how far his rationalism has carried him from the traditions of the Sith Order. Other Lords of the Sith had glorified the fight, the duel and the domination of battle. Tenebrous sought something colder, something clinical. His vision of victory was not conquest, it was sterilization. The Jedi rendered harmless by nothing more than a viral code. In this way, Tenebrous was a figure far ahead of his time. Where Sidious would later use armies and betrayals to destroy the Jedi, Tenebrous dreamed of a war won in silence. No grand battle, no climactic duels, only the Jedi awakening to find their power gone. Plagueis is remembered as the Sith Lord who sought to cheat death, the manipulator of life and the alchemist of biology, the one who nearly solved the riddle of immortality. But what is often overlooked is that this obsession was not born in isolation. It was the shadow of Tenebrous cast long over his apprentice. When Tenebrous had viewed the Force as an equation, Plagueis absorbed the rationalist lens and reshaped it for himself. The Bith had taught him to strip away mysticism, to reject the idea of the Force as a will, and to treat it as energy, waiting to be manipulated. To Tenebrous, the Force was programmable. To Plagueis, it was malleable, a biological system that could be bent with enough precision. Plagueis would take what his master began with the Maxichlorians and refined it into his own experience with midichlorian manipulation. If Tenebrous infected himself to carry his consciousness forward, Plagueis sought to reach into the cells of others, to bend life itself, to summon or deny existence at will. Where Tenebrous dreamed of erasing the Jedi through a virus, Plagueis pondered creating new life altogether. This is the great continuity of their line. Tenebrous gave Plagueis the lens, the Force as science, as numbers, as biology. Plagueis gave that lens ambition, taking his master's obsession and making it grander, stranger, and even more heretical. And yet there is a difference. Tenebrous believed he had solved the equation of destiny. He gave up precognition because he thought the future was certain, calculated. Plagueis was less absolute. He recognized the Force as volatile, uncertain, but still believed that it could be bent with enough knowledge. If Tenebrous was an engineer, Plagueis was the scientist. Both believe in the same truth, that the Force could be rewritten. They only disagreed on the method on how to do it. The death of Tenebrous should have been the end. Crushed beneath the collapsing cavern of Pal Demnik, his body broken, his own apprentice betraying him. This was the fate of so many Sith that preceded him. But Tenebrous is not like other Sith, so it's appropriate that his fate isn't either. His final words to Plagueis carried the cold recognition of a master who had foreseen his own defeat and calculated it into inevitability. But for Tenebrous, death was not the end. As his body failed, the Maxichlorians within him awoke. The virus he had engineered had done its work. His altered midichlorians carried his essence, his thoughts, and his will. Where the spirit of a normal being would dissolve into the cosmic force, Tenebrous's lingered. His consciousness slipped free from his corpse and into his apprentice, flowing invisibly into the cells of Plagueis. And for a moment, his victory seemed absolute and complete. The experiment had worked. He had achieved what thousands of years of Sith Lords had failed to grasp. He had conquered death not with sorcery, not with ritual, but with science. Within Plagueis, Tenebrous found a host. He could see through his apprentice's foresight, access the visions of the future that had been denied him after rewriting his own biology. At last, he believed he had proven his thesis. The Force could be programmed, and immortality was a solvable equation. But the vision that came to him was not one of triumph, it was of terror. Fans of our holocron of the worst ways to die in Star Wars are familiar with the fate of Tenebrous. Through Plagueis' eyes, Tenebrous glimpsed the smear of darkness that marked his apprentice's fate. Plagueis would be murdered by his own apprentice, killed before the work was complete. The grand plan would collapse. All of Tenebrous's careful predictions would unravel into failure. Plagueis would die. For the first time maybe in his life, the Sith engineer panicked. The certainty of his equations dissolved. The future was no longer inevitable, his model was shattered. In desperation, Tenebrous tore himself free of Plagueis, flinging his essence outward, seeking escape, seeking a new host. But in doing that, he discovered another flaw. The retrovirus that had granted him survival had also corrupted his foresight. Instead of stretching into the future, his perception collapsed inward. He was no longer looking ahead, he was looking back, trapped in a loop, forced to relive the last moments of his life over and over again. The collapse of the cavern, the betrayal, the failure of his calculations, his own death, it all played endlessly in a cycle without end. This was his eternity, not the triumph of immortality, but a mockery of it. He had become the prisoner of his own creation. And here lies the great irony of Tenebrous. He had believed the Force was an equation, that it could be solved, rewritten, reduced to code. He sacrificed his foresight to prove this. He corrupted his own cells to extend life. He dreamed of erasing the Jedi by silencing their connection to the Force. And now, the Force had silenced him. The Maxichlorians did not grant him the freedom that he had sought. They granted him a cage. They proved that no matter how the Sith sought to dominate the Force always found a way to dominate them. When we look back on the Sith, arrogance is a common thread. Bane believed he had perfected the Sith in the rule of two. Plagueis believed he had mastered life and death. Sidious believed he was the embodiment of the dark side, a god in the mortal flesh. But none of them ever dreamed as boldly or maybe as darkly as Tenebrous did. For Tenebrous's plan was not simply to defeat the Jedi through war or manipulation or extermination. His vision was colder, more absolute. He dreamed of a galaxy where the Jedi did not need to be hunted, where their lightsabers would gather dust, where their temples would stand quiet, where the Order itself would collapse not from battle, but in biology. One generation of Jedi waking to find their connection gone, then the next, then the next. A slow death not of flesh, but of essence. No clone armies, no great war, no duels, silence. That is what existed to Tenebrous. It is perhaps the boldest assault on the Jedi ever conceived, an erasure of their identity. And even though Tenebrous failed, The thought of such a plan still chills the imagination. And that is his fate. That is why it's so poetic. The Force does not tolerate arrogance without consequence. Plagueis was betrayed in his sleep. Sidious was consumed when his apprentice was redeemed. But Tenebrous was punished in the most fitting way imaginable. The man who believed the Force was an equation became trapped in an endless cycle, a broken line of code, reliving his death for all eternity. He sought to erase the Jedi from the Force. Instead, the Force erased Tenebrous. And so, my friends, what are your thoughts on this? One of the boldest plans in all of Star Wars lore. Imagine a story where all of the Jedi wake up one day and they simply can no longer touch the Force. That was the plan of Tenebrous. But as always, my friends, lore junkies, and acolytes, leave your thoughts on this Dark Lord in the comments down below. And what are your thoughts on the evolution of the Rule of Two, from Tenebrous to Plagueis to Sidious? How each of them attempted to reinvent the Force, and how the Force itself humbled them all in return. Subscribe, my fellow acolytes, for more dark side lore, and have a phenomenal day.